Good morning. David, I thought, gave Logan some very good counsel as I think, as he said that entering into the waters of baptism doesn't promise us that every day is going to be a good day moving forward. And I think sometimes in our naivete that we sometimes think that following Christ entitles me to good days and good days only. And Psalms 118:24 tells us, "For this is the day which the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it." And when we make the phrase, "this is the day," it's easy to say that I'm going to rejoice in the day on the good days. It's easy to say that at Thanksgiving dinner. It's easy to say that on Easter Sundays and snow days and vacation days. But every day is a gift from God. And that may not seem easy to remember. That may not seem easy to believe in those moments when our lives seem to be going up in flames. But just as a forest uses fires to replenish itself and give birth to new life, God uses the burning embers of our days to grow a new and deeper hope and faith in Him. And so this morning we have just a few minutes before we get to participate in witnessing Logan's confirmation. And so I want to talk a few minutes about that, about our ability to have peace, to find joy, and to be thankful in relation to our proportion or our perspective on life. And the anchor for my thoughts this morning are going to come from the 4th chapter of Philippians. So if you want to turn along, we're going to go into 4th chapter of Philippians, starting in verse 6. And Paul's letter to the Philippians is often referred to as the Epistle of Joy. And it's widely believed among theologians that Paul wrote the letter to the people of Philippi while he was, in fact, in prison. And so understanding that or recognizing that gives us some perspective as we read these verses. And so as Paul writes this letter to the people of Philippi as he sits in prison, he, in his captivity, rejoices in the goodness of the Lord. And so we read in verse 6 of chapter 4, he says, "Be afflicted for nothing." Afflicted means to be troubled or burdened or distressed. It says, "Be troubled or burdened by nothing." Instead, he says, "But in everything," all right, in everything, and that means in every situation. "Instead, in every situation, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God." And if we do that, he says that's where the promise is found in verse 7. He says, "And the peace of God, which passes all understanding." Passes means to transcend or to rise above our finite understanding. "And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." So in those moments when life seems difficult, when you find yourself, as Paul did, sitting in prison, don't let that trouble you. Don't let that distress you, yet look to the Lord. And in verse 11, I think this is the most profound statement he makes. He says, "For I have learned," and this only comes through perspective, this only comes through experience, this only comes through trials of the ups and downs and the good and bad in life. He says, "For I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content." And so as Paul sat in prison, writing to the letter of Philippi, he recognized that everything can be taken from a person. Everything can be taken from a man or woman, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, and that's to choose your perspective, to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances. And so my question is, I look at Paul and say, where did Paul gain that strength and perspective from? And it simply came from his faith in a loving and merciful God. And David was another one who shared that same perspective as Paul. And I'm going to, if you would, turn to Psalms 57. And in Psalms 57, we read these words by David. He says, beginning in verse 1, he says, "Be merciful unto me, O God, be merciful unto me, for my soul trusts in thee. Yea, in the shadow of thy wings will I make my refuge until these calamities be overpast." He said, so to give us again some perspective, David is hiding in a cave from Saul. Saul is pursuing David, wanting to take his very life. And so David, sitting in this cave, writes these passages, "Lord, I am taking mercy under your wings." He says, "Be good to me, God. Show me mercy. I am taking refuge from this storm, this dire situation, under your wings." And in verse 7, he says, "My heart is fixed, O God. My heart is fixed." He says, "I'm not going to take my eyes, my thoughts, my focus off of you. I know that when I fix my thoughts on you, when I place my trust in you, you will provide." And we see that borne out in David's life from a very early time. And we read back in 1 Samuel, very familiar. The account and the stories of David is very familiar to all of us from a young age. We read about read about David and his challenge as he faces Goliath. And we read about it in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And it tells us that in 1 Samuel chapter 17, of course, we know that the Israelite army is in battle with the Philistines, and they have this mountain masquerading as a man in the name of Goliath. And it tells us in the early verses of chapter 17 the size and the girth of Goliath. And it tells us that he was 6 cubits in a span. A cubit's the length from your fingertip to your elbow. So it's approximately, depending on the size of a person, 17 to 21 inches. So that means that Goliath could have been somewhere between 8 foot and as tall as 9'6". That's an enormous man. And it tells us in verses 5 and 7, it tells us about the coat of armor that he wore. And it tells us that he wore a coat of armor that weighed 5,000 shekels, and a shekel is a quarter ounce. So that his coat of arms was 70. So with 5,000 shekels is 78 pounds. So he's wearing this coat of arms at 78 pounds, and then it tells us that the tip of his spear weighed 600 shekels. That's 15 pounds. That's a lot of weight. Go to the gym. Next time you're to the gym, pick up a 15-pound dumbbell and try to throw it across the gym. That's pretty heavy. So it gives you an idea of how large this man is. Well, it tells us in verse 8 that Goliath would come out. And it says, he stood and he cried unto the armies of Israel, and he said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? In other words, come out and fight me. I'm a Philistine, you're Israelites, we're supposed to be fighting. He says, Choose you a man, and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Now, if you read on in chapter 17, it tells us in verse 16 that this had gone on for 40 days. He continues for 40 days to come out and challenge the Israelite army to send somebody out and fight him. And yet in verse 11, it tells us how the Israelite army continued to respond. It says in verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And so the question is, where was the focus of the Israelite army? What were they fixed on? Remember in Psalms 57, David said, my heart is fixed on thee, O Lord. And so the question is, where was their focus fixed on? Instead of being fixed on the Lord, it was fixed on that challenge, that obstacle, that trial that stood before them. Well, we know as we read on in chapter 17 that David's father sends him out to take provisions to his brothers who are on the front line battling the Philistines. And it tells us in verse 23, as David is there, rise with these provisions for his brothers, it says, and as he talked with them, he being David, talked with them, his brothers, he says, as he talked with them, behold, there came up a champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of Philistines, and spake according to the same words. In other words, going back to what he was challenging in verses 8 through 10. So Goliath issues these challenges again to the Philistine army. And so David is an actual witness of this at this moment in time. And it says in verse 24, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. And so these men, these grown men, are sitting there looking at this mountain as a mountain of a man and afraid of challenging him. And yet David, this little shepherd boy, responds in verse 26. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? In other words, who do you think you are, Goliath? You are not bigger than my God. In those moments in our lives when we face a challenge, when we face an obstacle, whether it be in a relationship, whether it be financial, it be physical, whatever that challenge, that issue may be, remember the words of David. Who are you? And insert your challenge. You are not bigger than my God. And it tells us, of course, we know how the story ends, and that David is able to overcome Goliath and to conquer him in that. There was a farmer who woke up in the hospital to find his wife by his side. And he said, you know, Martha, when we were first married, hail destroyed our crop, and you were there by my side. He said, 2 years later, when lightning struck the barn and destroyed the barn and the crop, you were there by my side. Still later, when we got into dairy farming and the disease ravaged the herd, you were right there by my side. And she responded, yes, George, I was. And he said, now that I'm really sick and here in the hospital, again, you are here by my side. And she said, yes, I am, George. Then George responded, you know, Martha, I'm beginning to think you're a jinx. Proverbs 17:20 tells us that he with a froward heart findeth no good. In 1946, there was a book published by a psychologist named Viktor Frankl. It's titled Man's Search for Meaning. And if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it. And it's in my opinion, a very profound text. And it describes in part of the book, the book is broken down into two parts. The first part recounts his experience spending time in the Nazi concentration camps. And he recounts in that book the horrible, quite frankly, the unspeakable horrors that occurred during his imprisonment in the Nazi concentration camps. And during that time, his father, his mother, his brother, his wife all died in those camps. And despite losing all of his possessions, suffering from hunger, cold, and brutality, and expecting his very own execution to come at any moment, he still found hope. And he found that despite his circumstances, he still possessed the ability to choose his attitude given those circumstances. And he said, one of the lines in the text, he says, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds meaning. And he believed that a man's spirit can rise above his surroundings if he simply has faith and hope. In the passage, he said, what was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. We had to learn ourselves, and furthermore, we had to teach the despairing man that it did not matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life daily and hourly. Our question must consist not in talk, but in right action and right conduct. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the task which it constantly sets for each individual. You see, our ability to find peace, or to have peace, to find joy, and to be thankful is directly proportionate to our perspective. A challenge in respect to today is a big problem. A challenge in respect to our lifespan is a small problem. And a challenge in respect to eternity is no problem at all. In your time, if you get a chance, I would encourage you to read chapter 16 of the book of Acts, talking about Paul and Silas being imprisoned and their response to that imprisonment and how they responded to those difficult situations. There was a Christian who labored in a Chinese prison camp for 18 years. And the communist regime that was in charge of that camp rewarded his faith with sewage duty. And so what they did was they kept the human waste in these pools and allowed it to ferment so that it would become fertilizer. And this pit, these cesspools, seethed with stink and disease. And the guards and the prisoners alike avoided those cesspools at all costs. And after he had spent several weeks working there, the very stench of that place pigmented his skin. The smell of it could not be washed out of his skin. And so we can imagine the plight. He's far away from home. He's alone in prison and forced to work in, quite frankly, deplorable conditions. And yet somehow this godly man found a garden in those cesspools. He said, I was thankful for being sent to the cesspool. This was the only place I was not under surveillance. I could pray and sing openly to the Lord. When I was there, the cesspool became my private garden. As David indicated to Logan, we will have trouble. There is no might or maybe about it. But we have every reason to be encouraged. As Christ said, and as recorded in the 16th chapter of John, verse 33, Christ says, in me you might have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. Who do you think you are, Goliath? You are not bigger than my God. As Christians, we must have an attitude, as it says, of gratitude. We must see everything in life as a gift from a good and loving God. And I think that sometimes we make the mistake that in order to be happy, in order to be grateful, that we have to have happy experiences in life. Happiness does not emanate from good happenings. It springs from something deeper called joy. And regardless of what happens, joy comes from knowing that God has a plan and I am a part of it. As I close my thoughts this morning, I leave you with this passage of Scripture from the section 58 of Doctrine and Covenants. It tells us, "You cannot behold with your natural eyes for the present time the design of your God concerning those things which shall come hereafter, and the glory which shall follow after much tribulation. For after much tribulation come the blessings." And so it's my hope and my prayer that, as Paul writes, that we always be joyful, never stop praying, and be thankful in all circumstances, for this is God's will for us.